Can you hear me? Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-aliyyil azim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina wa Nabiyyina Abil Qasim al-Mustafa Muhammad. Wa alihi at-tayyibin at-tahirin la siyama baqiyatullahi fil aradin ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif. اللهم أخرجني من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمني بنور الفهم اللهم افتح علينا أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. Inshallah, from today we start the book by Ayatullah Mutahhri on Introduction to Islamic Philosophy. This is part of a series which is originally called Ashenayi Ba Ulum-e Islami, and it's translated as Understanding Islamic Sciences. Ayatullah Mutahhri, as you know, after many years of study and teaching in Qom, he had to move to Tehran, and one of the maybe reasons was financial situation, but also either from the beginning this was planned or it was Allah's plan to be more in touch with university professors and students, and also since Tehran was the capital, so this gave him more exposure. So he started teaching in University of Tehran in the Faculty of Theology. Initially it was called دانشکده معقول و منقول. معقول و منقول means intellectual and transmitted sciences. Later they changed the name to Ilahiyat, theology. So he used to teach there, and such a great scholar. Sometimes used to teach undergraduate courses, sometimes he used to teach graduate courses. Salaam alaikum. So one of the things that he used to teach for undergraduate students was Introduction to Islamic Sciences, and then later these became books. So he had Introduction to Logic, Introduction to Philosophy, Introduction to Science of Kalam, Introduction to Irfan, Introduction to Fiqh, Introduction to Usul al-Fiqh. Alhamdulillah, we studied in Hujjat Academy Introduction to Kalam, Introduction to Fiqh, Introduction to Usul al-Fiqh. In Hose, we started Introduction to Logic. Online, we started Introduction to Irfan. So now with this, inshallah, this series becomes complete. Introduction to Philosophy. All the sections of that book becomes, inshallah, complete. In addition to that, this would be a step for people who want to study Islamic philosophy properly. So this is the first step, and inshallah, I hope we can have more advanced courses on philosophy. But if you are interested in really studying philosophy, you need to also study logic. At least quickly listen to Introduction to Logic. For this book, it's not necessary, but it helps. But if you really want to continue, you have to study logic. Also, for your information, we had in the house in London 2 series on philosophy. One is called Introduction to Islamic Philosophy, but that is not this one. That is much more advanced. The book was called Falsafe Muqaddamati. So that is some 30 lectures on Islamic philosophy. So that is more advanced. And then after that, we had Bidayatul Hikmah. So those two are also available for future, but inshallah we will teach also some other books. So I hope we would have a, inshallah, variety of different courses on Islamic philosophy for English speaking community, inshallah. Okay, let us start with the very first lesson of Introduction to Islamic Philosophy. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. The very first thing is to know what's the definition of philosophy. But this term is not a very simple term. It has a history, long history behind it. Ayatullah Mutahhri says, whenever we want to define something, sometimes we want to clarify the meaning of that term. This is what he calls a ta'rif al-lafzi, a kind of linguistic definition. In some traditional book, we call it sharh al-lafz. Sometimes we just explain the word for the people who are not familiar with this word. Either they speak other languages. For example, they don't know Arabic. They ask, what is fiqh? What is, I don't know, usul? What is tafsir? Sometimes we explain just the word. Sometimes the question is not knowing the literal meaning. The question is, what is this in its nature? What is this in its reality? What is its mahiyya? For example, sometimes a person who doesn't know Arabic says, what is insan? You say insan means a human being. But sometimes he says, no, I know it means human being, but what is a human being? So the question is not just tell me the meaning of this word. The question, what is this concept? What is this reality? What is its essence? And here then those who study logic, they know that here then we have had and rasm, different types of definition to explain something based on its essentials, etc. So, with respect to philosophy, we have to clarify the meaning of this term and a little history behind it, and then what we mean by philosophy. In Greek history, we have very important era. We have a kind of golden era, which is starting with Socrates, and perhaps we can say peak of it is up to Aristotle. So Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Plato was a student of Socrates, and most of the things that we know about Socrates is through the writings of Plato and through the dialogue that normally Plato brings, and he tells us that Socrates had this discussion or dialogue with other people. In the time of Socrates, there were some people who were known as sophists. Sophists, from Sophia, meaning knowledge, or sometimes meaning wisdom. They were called sophists as a claim that they are learned people. But in reality, unfortunately, these people were people who were very wrong in their philosophical assumptions. They had the idea that there is no universal truth. Human beings are the basis of everything, and we are making reality. There's nothing that we have to discover. These people used to be more engaged in legal cases. They were good, solicitors professionally, and they were able to prove someone who is guilty, not guilty, and someone who was not guilty, they were able to say he's guilty. Little by little, they themselves doubted reality. Initially, they were disregarding the truth, but then finally, they said there is no truth because we can make decision who is going to win, who is going to lose, etc. So, Sufis like Protagoras, they tried then to say either there is no truth, or even if there is truth, we cannot know it, we cannot discover it. Socrates didn't want to be associated with these people, because Socrates also was a person of thinking and discussing, somehow similar to them, but with different nature and different interest. He was very interested in truth. And also he was very humble person. So in order not to be associated with them, and in order to keep his humility, he called himself Philo, means a lover of Sophia, means knowledge, means I am a lover of knowledge. I am not a knowledgeable person, I am not a learned person, I am not a scholar, I just love knowledge, a lover of knowledge. Ayatullah Mutahhri says before Socrates this term was not used as a title. Even after Socrates, it was not quickly adopted by others. And he says, as far as we know, Aristotle didn't use this term in this sense. So it was just used in a literal sense by Socrates to say that I am a student, many of our great ulama, they really not as a kind of exaggeration or formality. They really say we are a student, we are talaba, because we are always seeker of knowledge. So he said, I am a lover of knowledge. But gradually, this term was coined for a special way of study. Ayatullah Mutahhri then refers to, because this book is about Islamic philosophy, refers to the situation or the history of this term in Islamic world. When Muslims started translating some Greek books into Arabic and introducing these figures like Socrates, etc., to Muslim world, they changed this Greek world and made it, we say, mu'arrab. They somehow Arabicized it, and they, when you look at it, falsafa, you think it's a Arabic term, but it's not really Arabic. It's a conversion here, and they kept it as a name for modern science, which deals with all intellectual studies. Because Aristotle used to classify sciences in a way which was interesting and acceptable to many Muslim thinkers. And one branch or main branch of sciences, according to Aristotle, is intellectual sciences. Muslims liked this, so they kept this as intellectual sciences. But because we had many Islamic sciences also new to this world, because Muslims, developed many sciences, so they made some changes. And it is very interesting that Muslims were not just translating. They were translating, they were commenting, sometimes criticizing, sometimes accepting, sometimes adding, developing. So it's interesting that they were not just some translators. So they came up with this idea that we can say we have two types of sciences: ulum aqli, ulum naqli. Intellectual sciences and transmitted sciences. For intellectual sciences, like Aristotle, they classified it into two groups: theoretical and practical. For theoretical intellectual sciences, they mentioned what we call today philosophy, and inshallah we'll talk about it more. You can, for ease, you can say metaphysics, but inshallah we'll clarify this more. Then they had tabi'iyat, which is a kind of intellectual study of natural phenomenon. It's not like chemistry and physics today, because chemistry and physics are empirical, but they had intellectual approach to study physical world in addition to empirical approach. They also had interest in mathematics, great interest in mathematics, different branches of mathematics, whether it be geometry, whether it be algebra, even astronomy, even music. They used to study music as part of mathematical studies. The practical branch was mostly ethics. They called it akhlaq, house economy, and politics. Tadbir al-manzil, how to manage your house economy and affairs, and siyasatul mudun, politics. So theoretical sciences, practical sciences, but all with intellectual approach, with aqli approach. This is what Muslims called falsafa. So when they said falsafa, they meant someone who knows all these. When they said philosoph, a philosopher, someone who knew all these things. Knew tabi'iyat, physics, knew metaphysics, knew mathematics, knew music even. You know, someone like Farabi, he was great also in music. Even Avicenna, for example, has a study about music. Brother of Allama Tabatabai had a book on music, and he then thought it might be misused, so he somehow kept it hidden, or I don't know. Anyway, it's not available. So a philosopher was someone who knew all these things and knew akhlaq, knew tadbir al-manzil, siyasatul mudun, all these things, because philosophy was a modern science, and all these came out of it. Even if you study history of our houses, you find that up to a few decades ago, all these sciences were taught in the hawza. Even today, still some people study. For example, Ayatullah Allama Tabatabai in Najaf studied mathematics, because his teacher of philosophy told him that for philosophy you need to have trained your mind to work very, very carefully and according to mathematics. So he used to take lessons on mathematics, And it might be interesting for you that he was the architect of Madrasa Hujjatiyya in Qom. Ayatullah Hasanzadeh Amuli is a great mathematician. So these things were studied and taught in the Hawza. But later, because of opening universities and also Islamic sciences became more and more deeper, so somehow then we can say they specialized more in other sciences. So philosophy in the Islamic world became a general science, or a science which was like a mother, like a root, which included anything which has intellectual methodology, ulum aqli, whether it be theoretical or practical. Then Muslim philosophers, because they were aware that all these sciences are not at the same level, they had a special regard for one branch of these intellectual sciences, which somehow was more fundamental. They realized that all other sciences need this one, but this one doesn't need any other sciences. And this is what they called ilm kulli. Sometimes they called ilm kulli. Ilm kulli, you can say universal science, for example, or general science, or ilm ula, or ilahiyat bil ma'na al-a'am. They gave different names to it, but it was something of a different nature, because this was the science that studied existence as such. Existence as such. What do I mean by existence as such? موجود بما هو موجود. Because other sciences deal with some type of being. For example, in some sciences we deal with human body, about illnesses, In some sciences we deal about numbers. In some sciences we deal about, for example, line and like geometry, etc. Every science has a subject matter that is specific. But in this general science, we talk about being as such, means any being. Our discussions are not limited to a particular group. It's about any being. It can be wajibul wujud, it can be mumkinul wujud, it can be God, it can be creatures. Any being. So sometimes then they used it for this one. Sometimes they use it for all intellectual sciences. Nowadays, normally when we say philosophy, we mean this one. We mean the science that studies being as being, or being as such, or existence as such. And there is a little history here also at the beginning of lesson 2. I mentioned that because I think it's related to this. But the rest of lesson 2, I'll leave it inshallah for next week. When Aristotle died, they tried to organize his writings and his works. For every science that he had worked on, there was a name. But they found that there are some discussions that they cannot give a specific name to it because it was very general. What they gave, it was a practical name. They call it metaphysica. Means ma ba'da tabi'iyat. Sometimes they say ma ba'da tabi'ah, but basically was the section after tabi'iyat. If, for example, instead of tabi'iyat, they had put it after mathematics, they could call it ma ba'da riyadiyat, for example. Yeah? So this meant discussion or section after physics, but intellectual physics. Okay? Some people later mistakenly thought this discussion is about ma wara at-tabiyah, something beyond nature. Means only immaterial things. But they wondered, Aristotle here also talks about things that can be natural because he talks about every kind of being. Later, it became clearer that no, this was just a practical name. They didn't mean this is beyond nature. They just mean after the section on tabi'iyat. So the name metaphysics today is because of this history, or ma ba'da tabi'a in Arabic. In English they say metaphysics. But you have to remember, metaphysics doesn't mean things which are supernatural or immaterial. Metaphysics is a kind of a study which is about existence as existence. It can be about immaterial things, it can be about material things. Lots of discussions that we have in philosophy are for mumkin al-wujud. And mumkin al-wujud can be mujarrad, can be maddi. We will inshallah discuss. So, what inshallah we are going to study in this course is an introduction to Islamic philosophy as a science which rationally or intellectually deals with general properties, general characteristics of existence. Al-ahwal al-amma lil-mawjood bima huwa mawjood. We discuss general conditions of being as such. Ayatullah Mutahhri in the second lesson refers also to the history of this term in Western world, which inshallah we'll discuss it in the next session inshallah. So alhamdulillah, we finished lesson 1 and part of lesson 2. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin.